Let me be very clear about something. What you are watching unfold in the Middle East right now is not a random eruption of violence. It is not a miscalculation. It is not a surprise. What you are witnessing is the logical, inevitable, and entirely predictable conclusion of a process that has been building for decades. And the reason no one expected it is not because the signs weren't there. The signs were always there. The reason no one expected it is because most people are not paying attention to the right things. They are watching the headlines. They are not reading history. So let me tell you what is actually happening. And more importantly, let me tell you why it matters to every single person watching this. Not just to people in the Middle East, not just to Americans, not just to Israelis or Iranians, to everyone. Because what is happening in that region right now is directly connected to the price of your food, the stability of your currency, and the future of the global order that you and your children will have to live inside. Let's start with the geography because geography never lies. The Middle East sits at the center of the world. This is not a metaphor. This is a literal, physical, logistical fact. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow channel of water between Iran and Oman, controls the passage of approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply. 20%. Think about what that means. Japan gets 75% of its oil through that strait. South Korea, India, Pakistan, China, every major Asian economy is existentially dependent on that body of water staying open. The moment that strait closes, and it has been threatened, it has been partially disrupted, and it could close completely, you do not just have a Middle Eastern crisis, you have a global economic crisis. You have governments that start making desperate decisions, and desperate governments do desperate things. Now, here is what most analysts are getting wrong. They keep treating this current escalation as a bilateral conflict. They keep framing it as Iran versus Israel, or Iran versus the United States, or Shia versus Sunni. These are surface-level descriptions. They are not wrong, but they are dangerously incomplete. What is actually happening is a struggle over the architecture of the entire post-World War, our world order. The petrodollar system, the arrangement by which oil is priced and sold in American dollars, which gives the United States an almost miraculous ability to print money and export inflation. That system is under the most serious challenge it has faced since its creation in the 1970s. And Iran is the pivot point of that challenge. Let me explain this more precisely. Russia, after its invasion of Ukraine, made a strategic bet. The bet was this: if Russia can hold Ukraine, it controls on a third of the world's carbohydrate production. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. Russian gas heats European homes. Russian and Ukrainian wheat feeds the Middle East and Africa. If Russia wins in Ukraine and Iran survives American pressure in the Middle East, then you have an alternative axis forming Russia, Iran, China that does not need the dollar to transact, that trades in rubles, in UN, in alternative currencies. And if that axis solidifies, the American empire as we currently understand it begins to dissolve. Not overnight, not in a single explosion, but slowly and then very, very quickly. This is why the current Middle East escalation is not just about regional power. It is about whether the United States can maintain its grip on the global financial system. And this is also why the current escalation is more dangerous than anything we have seen in decades. Because both sides in this struggle believe they are fighting for their survival. You do not compromise when you believe you are fighting for your survival. You escalate. Now let us look at what has actually changed in recent weeks, because the tempo of events has accelerated dramatically. The signals were ignored for too long. The proxy wars, the drone strikes, the accumulation of forward deployed forces. All of this was treated by the media as background noise, but none of it was noise. All of it was preparation. Every military analyst who was paying attention could see that the threshold for direct confrontation was being lowered step by step in the same way that a frog sits in water that is being slowly brought to a boil. And now the water is boiling. What changed? Several things changed simultaneously, and their convergence is what created the current crisis. First, the internal political pressures inside multiple governments reached a breaking point. At the same time, leaders who had been managing tension found that managing tension was no longer politically viable. Their domestic audiences wanted action. Second, the military posture of the regional actors shifted from deterrence to preparation for actual engagement. These are fundamentally different postures. Deterrence says, I have this capability and I will use it if you cross this line. Preparation for engagement says, I'm getting ready to use it regardless of what you do. That shift is crucial. Third, the economic pressures created by the war in Ukraine, by sanctions regimes, by dollar inflation, by debt crises across the global south. Those pressures created a set of incentives that made confrontation more attractive to certain actors than continued stalemate. And this brings me to the most important point, the one that almost nobody in mainstream Western media is discussing. When you look at the incentive structures of the various parties involved in this escalation, and I mean really look at them, not just at the surface level stated goals, but at the underlying structural incentives, you find something disturbing. Multiple parties actually benefit from escalation, not from peace, from escalation. Think about this carefully. A government that is facing domestic economic crisis and declining popular support benefits enormously from the rally around the flag effect that military confrontation produces. A weapons industry that has just spent several years observing record revenues from the Ukraine conflict benefits from a new theater of conflict opening up. An intelligence establishment that justifies its enormous budgets through the existence of existential threats benefits when those threats appear to materialize. A political ideology, and there are several at play here, that has an eschatological end times dimension to its worldview literally believes that escalating conflict in the Holy Land is not a catastrophe to be avoided, but a divine process to be accelerated. These are not fringe beliefs held by a handful of extremists. What many people still fail to grasp is that these are not merely abstract ideas discussed in academic journals or debated on television panels. These beliefs, assumptions, and strategic calculations are influencing the decisions of individuals who sit inside the rooms where real power is exercised. They shape the thinking of policymakers, military planners, intelligence officials, and political leaders whose choices can alter the course of history. Once you understand this reality, once you recognize that the incentive structures of multiple powerful actors are increasingly aligned toward escalation rather than de-escalation, something changes. The current crisis no longer appears surprising. In fact, what becomes surprising is not that tensions are rising, but that the situation managed to remain contained for as long as it did. The deeper one examines the dynamics at play, the clearer it becomes that the forces driving this confrontation are not temporary or accidental. They are structural. They are embedded within the strategic interests, domestic political pressures, ideological commitments, and security calculations of the major actors involved. Each side believes it is acting rationally. Each side believes it is protecting its interests. Yet, history repeatedly demonstrates that rational decisions made in isolation can combine to produce profoundly irrational outcomes on a global scale. The military dimension of this crisis deserves particular attention because it is changing rapidly and its implications are being systematically underestimated. For decades, much of Western strategic thinking has rested upon a fundamental assumption that overwhelming air superiority provides a decisive military advantage. The belief has been that a technologically superior military force can degrade an opponent's infrastructure, destroy command networks, eliminate strategic assets, and ultimately force political capitulation without incurring the catastrophic costs associated with a large-scale ground war. Yet this assumption has repeatedly been challenged by history. It was challenged in Vietnam, where immense technological superiority failed to deliver the desired political outcome. It was challenged in Afghanistan, where 2 decades of military operations could not permanently reshape the political reality on the ground. It was challenged again in Lebanon in 2006, when one of the most advanced military forces in the world found itself unable to achieve decisive victory against a highly organized non-state actor operating through distributed command structures and sophisticated underground networks. Iran has spent decades studying these examples. Its military planners have analyzed every major conflict involving technologically superior powers attempting to impose their will upon determined adversaries. They have examined the strengths and weaknesses of conventional military doctrines and developed strategies designed specifically to exploit those weaknesses. The geography of Iran itself plays a critical role in this calculation. Its vast mountainous terrain, extensive strategic depth, dispersed industrial infrastructure, and large population create challenges that cannot be solved through air power alone. What outsiders often perceive as obstacles are, from a military perspective, strategic advantages. They complicate targeting, increase resilience, and make rapid military victory extraordinarily difficult. However, what makes the current moment genuinely unprecedented is not Iran's defensive capability alone. The greater challenge lies in the broader network that has emerged across the region over several decades. In Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, interconnected resistance movements have developed capacities designed to create a multi-front pressure system. These groups may differ in geography, organization, and tactics, but they share a strategic purpose, ensuring that pressure applied in one area generates consequences across several others. This creates a dilemma for any conventional military power. When pressure is applied to one front, additional fronts become active. When one threat appears manageable, several others emerge simultaneously. What may seem from the outside like a collection of separate actors increasingly functions as an interconnected strategic ecosystem. This is not an accidental feature of the system. It is the system. And thus far, no major power has demonstrated a comprehensive solution capable of neutralizing all components simultaneously without incurring significant costs. At the same time, the world's other major powers are watching these developments with extraordinary interest. Russia understands that a United States deeply engaged in Middle Eastern conflict possesses fewer resources, less diplomatic flexibility, and reduced political bandwidth for other strategic theaters. Every military deployment, every diplomatic initiative, and every financial commitment directed toward the Persian Gulf is attention that cannot be fully devoted elsewhere. From Moscow's perspective, prolonged American engagement in the Middle East offers strategic breathing room. China's calculations are equally significant, though perhaps even longer term. Beijing views competition with the United States not as a short-term contest, but as a decades-long strategic marathon. Chinese policymakers understand that the most effective way to prevail in a prolonged competition is not necessarily through direct confrontation, but through patience, endurance, and the gradual shifting of global balances of power. A United States consumed by recurring Middle Eastern crises faces enormous financial costs, growing domestic political divisions, military strain, and declining strategic focus. If Washington arrives at future moments of competition, whether over Taiwan, technological dominance, semiconductor supply chains, or the architecture of the Pacific Order, in a weakened position, Beijing's relative strategic position improves. From this perspective, instability in the Middle East is not merely a regional issue, it becomes a variable within a much larger global equation. And this is where the true danger emerges. This is the trap that many serious analysts warned about years ago. The trap is not that any single actor deliberately seeks global catastrophe. The trap is that each individual step toward escalation appears rational when viewed from the perspective of the actor taking it. One government responds to a perceived threat. Its rival responds to that response. Allies become involved to protect credibility and deterrence. Countermeasures trigger additional countermeasures. Every move possesses an internal logic. Every decision can be justified. Every action appears limited, measured, and necessary. Yet the cumulative effect of these individually rational decisions can produce outcomes that are catastrophic for nearly everyone involved. History is filled with examples. Perhaps the most famous occurred during the summer of 1914. Few leaders desired the global conflict that ultimately became the First World War. Most believed they were making limited, manageable decisions intended to protect national interests and preserve stability. Yet, a web of alliances, misunderstandings, strategic calculations, and escalating commitments transformed a regional crisis into one of history's greatest disasters. The tragedy was not that leaders wanted catastrophe. The tragedy was that the system produced catastrophe despite their intentions. That historical lesson should not be ignored. The dynamics visible today bear uncomfortable similarities to past periods when geopolitical tensions moved beyond the control of those attempting to manage them. This is not alarmism, it is not sensationalism. It is a sober assessment of structural realities. The question that now matters above all others is whether individuals and institutions with sufficient power, wisdom, and political courage still possess the ability to interrupt this cycle before it reaches a point of no return. History offers examples of such interventions. There have been moments when diplomacy prevailed over confrontation, when restraint overcame emotion, and when leaders recognized the dangers of continuing down a path that seemed increasingly inevitable. Yet history also reminds us of something less comforting. Sometimes those interventions arrive too late, and sometimes they never arrive at all. When that happens, entire generations inherit the consequences. The Middle East crisis should not be viewed as a distant regional problem unfolding on television screens thousands of miles away. The forces colliding there are deeply interconnected with the global systems upon which modern life depends. Energy markets, international trade, currency stability, military alliances, supply chains, technological competition, political legitimacy. The consequences of decisions made in that region do not remain confined to that region. They ripple outward across the entire international system. They influence the prices families pay for fuel and food. They affect economic growth, financial markets, national security policy.